What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with another reaction video, and in this one we have, why do British and American fire hydrants look so different? We know there's similarities, but we know there's a ton of differences between the US and the UK. But a fire hydrant looking different is something that I would have never guessed. I absolutely cannot believe that it would be different than the UK and the US would have different fire hydrants. But before we dive in and see what the fire hydrants, I guess for me to see what the fire hydrants in the UK look like, if you would like to support this channel by becoming a member, all you gotta do is hit that join button to receive your exclusive benefits. Let's see what's so different about them and why they're so different.
Coming from the US, one thing you eventually start to wonder when you move to the UK is, where are all the fire hydrants? American fire hydrants are visible. They're recognizable. Yes. They're just a part of every American neighborhood, and you've definitely seen them in TV shows and movies, notably dogs using them for other purposes. But in the UK, they're seemingly nowhere to be found. And that's because, you guessed it, UK and USA fire hydrants are different, and in this video, we're diving deep into the whys, the whats, and the wheres to help you understand this fascinating topic that you never knew you needed to know. So to get started, fire hydrants have been important to the firefighting services since they figured out how to connect any sort of pipes to the water mains. Before then, you had water for firefighting kept in buckets and cauldrons, ready for use by bucket brigades. It's not that efficient, and the firefighting services were very glad when wooden mains water systems were installed around the 16th century. That meant they could dig down and connect to the pipes. Eventually, cast iron pipes replaced the wood, and permanent underground access points were included for firefighters. This is where the UK and the USA split in terms of how they connect to these mains. The cast iron hydrants that you see in the US were invented around 1801 by a man named Frederick Graff. Now, Frederick Graff was an engineer at Philadelphia Waterworks, and unfortunately, the exact design he had is unclear, as the records of it were in an office that burnt down. You cannot make this stuff up, and so with it went the blueprint of the first model, but he is really officially known as the inventor of this above-ground fire hydrant in some capacity. This led to the US fire hydrants being this above-ground model.
Okay, so with her saying he is the inventor of the above ground fire hydrants, I'm already assuming that UK's fire hydrants are gonna be below ground, which I think would make more sense. But there's got to be a reason that the US don't have them below ground, and I hope she explains it.
For your interest, the color of the hydrant does vary, and there's a system that is supposed to be used that shows the firefighters the water flow capability of the hydrant based on the color it's painted, but this is sometimes overruled by the local area and their own requirements. So each American firefighter will be familiar with what is most commonly used in their area, though they could take a good guess at hydrants across the US due to this attempt at standardization. You can see here how the hoses are attached to the hydrants to get the water flowing. Now, before we talk about the pros and cons of above ground hydrants, and more on that in a second, let's talk about what happens in the UK, because there are so many hydrants around, but they're not visible because they're underground. The fire service has direct access to the water mains via these underground connections, so they are neatly tucked away underneath a cover that looks like this. It's just a flap in the ground. The ones in my area are mostly painted yellow, but they don't have to be. You can see the FH for fire hydrant here. In addition, these are often marked by these yellow H signs, marking the distance and size of the pipe. There are a couple of numbers on the yellow sign. The larger number shows the size of the water main that feeds the hydrant in millimeters, and the smaller number indicates in meters the distance to the hydrant from the sign. Often there's also an arrow as well to point them in the literal right direction. British standards require fire hydrants to be tested and serviced once per year. Interestingly, now that we know British hydrants are typically underground, it's important to know that 99% of American hydrants are above ground, but there are some underground ones, particularly airport runways, because this avoids them becoming obstacles to the planes. Steve Hemingway, who worked in the hydrant industry in the US, tells the story of the underground fire hydrants he sold within the US, and that was to a theme park in the 1980s in Orlando that had a miniature version of China. Above ground hydrants here would have really ruined the sense of scale, so they went for the underground ones.
So why though? That's my burning question. Why have them above ground? Because above ground fire hydrants, like you see in TV shows and movies, hey, you get the right tool. Hey, somebody from the community can undo it. Not just TV show. I've seen it in real life. What am I talking about? Somebody can a community can just unscrew it, and we got kids out here playing in the water. We got kids having a good time, and I'm like, that's probably not what that water's supposed to be used for. Now that I look back on it, but originally I thought, what happened? Yeah, it's just normal. But now I'm like, that probably isn't what that water's supposed to be used for. But I mean, the hydrants are above ground. Why is this the case? I'm sure they don't have that problem in the UK. I'm just intrigued. Why above ground fire hydrants?
And to head back to the UK, you can still rarely find some above ground hydrants. Interestingly, there are some non-working ones on old RAF bases that were under American jurisdiction, as the base would have its own support system like fire and police. Because the American fire trucks were incompatible with the way that UK fire engines plug into the water mains, they had to have above ground hydrants. This still happens today in a few American bases across the UK. And now that we know the differences, let's talk about the why, because that's what I was really interested in.
Thank you.
Is it just a case of one country does it one way and the other country does it the other, like keyboards, and there's no real rhyme or reason? It's partially that. The above ground hydrant was invented by an American and it sort of just took hold there, while the underground access has always been the done thing in the UK. But if we look more closely, we can hypothesize on a few different reasons.
Okay.
Firstly, the pro for the underground access in the UK is it's space saving. Already the roads are cramped in communities and in cities, and adding above ground hydrants would just take up more space. People can easily walk over the underground hydrants, no problem, so you haven't added any additional infrastructure to get in their way on day-to-day life. Secondly, the underground access is via the pavement, known to Americans as the sidewalk, so it's not really as much of a problem of people obstructing them by parking near them like happens in the US, though they do still put out PSAs to not park over a hydrant, as parking on the pavement is common in some areas of the UK where space is at a premium, so be sure you're looking out for that if you drive and park in the UK. The underground system also discourages tampering. You can't easily vandalize a hydrant in the UK, and they're mostly left to their own devices until needed by fire services. Underground hydrants are also not harder to connect to than above ground ones. They just use some different equipment, so every fire truck in the UK carries a standard pipe to connect to them, rather than in the US where the cast iron risers are permanently attached to the hydrants. In other words, it seems to work for the UK. Now, the above ground
because it seems like it's a great option, right? Nobody's tampering with it. They're not getting in the way. They're still just as easily accessible. And they're tested once a year, so you know that they're working and everything. It seems like a great system of fire hydrants. I guess a great system of fire hydrants for the UK to me, I don't know why we wouldn't adopt that. But I believe she's finna explain it to us, and I'm very intrigued to hear why Americans do above ground.
The hydrants. In other words, it seems to work for the UK. Now, the above ground hydrants do offer some pluses and minuses as well. The minuses, as talked about, include that they are more easily tampered with by the general public, and they can be crashed into by people who don't know how to drive, or blocked by people parking where they aren't supposed to, effectively blocking off the truck's access to the fire hydrant. If this happens and you do block it in America, the fire services are more than allowed to do anything necessary to get hooked up to that water in an emergency, including breaking your car windows and pumping the water through the hose through your car. When it comes to space, typically there's a lot more room in the US than the UK, so the above ground hydrants aren't taking up that much space, and you could argue that they're at least a little bit easier to spot. You can't exactly pave over them on accident or bury them under dirt or leaves and things like that. The US also does have areas that receive an incredible amount of snowfall. In these instances, above ground hydrants are typically fitted with some kind of tall, colorful pole that's even taller than the hydrant to make sure that it can still be located in the snow. And you might argue that in the in-between states that do get a decent amount of snowfall, but not feet upon feet or meters upon meters, the above ground hydrants just make it easier to access without needing to clear a ton of snow away. That being said, in the US, there are 2 types of above ground hydrants used.
Dang, I mean, she bring a good point. I didn't think about these points. I didn't think about snow and weather conditions that could possibly hide that fire hydrant if it was underground, or you'd have to scoop out the way. Very valid points. Very, very valid points. Yes, they can be more easily tampered with. Yes, people can crash into them, as you've seen people have crashed into them. Water shooting up all over the place. I just learned never park in front of the fire hydrants. From this video, that is a lesson I have now learned, and will never park in front of a fire hydrant to come out to windows being broken and them having to go through my car. But okay, I see now that it's explained to me, America, I get it. And like she said, we do have more space here, so they're not much of a hassle for anybody just being above ground. They don't take up that much space.
A dry fire hydrant and a wet barrel hydrant. Wet barrel hydrants are used in warmer climates where it doesn't freeze. The barrel of the hydrant always has water in it. In a dry type hydrant, the barrel is actually empty and the water is stored below the frost line for the area where the hydrant is being used in. When the valve is open, it's allowed to flow through, but the water doesn't stay in the barrel all of the time to avoid it freezing, as you can't easily fight a fire with a frozen block of ice. US above ground hydrants also allow for higher water flow rates, which is often needed in America because of the obsession we have with building everything from timber, which sets on fire pretty easily. So which is better? I found one thread discussing the differences, and it seems that the American firefighters believed that the above ground hydrants were better, but that's to and it
I want
seems
to read what it says. Above ground works so much better. It's much quicker and easier to hook up the hoses. Back in the day, they didn't have fire hydrants, so they would have to dig the wood in something main and chop a hole in it to drop the fire hose into when they were finished at the fire. Would plug the hole and mark it on the map. This way, the next call they had would. I'm sorry, I can't. There's just words missing. There was a plug nearby because it was easier to get the plug out than gut it to the water line again. This was before pavement, concrete sidewalks, and iron pipe, which would make that pretty difficult today. Well, yeah, but their below ground hydrants aren't like that anymore. So I understand where he's coming from. Like before, the below ground fire hydrants, I guess, were just as good. But it seems like, I don't know. Y'all talk to me in the comment section. She's still got some stuff to explain.
So which is better? I found one thread discussing the differences, and it seems that the American firefighters believed that the above ground hydrants were better, but that's to be expected because that's what they're used to. Yeah. But mostly it seems to be a they're both fine kind of scenario.
That's what it looks like. The
worst case scenario for both, like a car destroying an above ground hydrant or a below ground hydrant being buried or too hard to find. It doesn't really happen that often anyway. It's the absolute worst case scenario, and both fire services have adapted to the type that they need to know how to use. So I would say on this one, we're not going to make any judgment calls on which is better and just say they work differently. So now you know, and if you have anything to add, as always, please do in the comment section below, as well as any ideas you have of future video topics. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
I think I'll go ahead and agree with her stance on they just work differently. Both are good for each country. Each country knows how to use the one that they have. And yeah, so I'll completely agree with her. Not going to choose a side. Going to say, yeah, now that I know the pros and cons of both of these hydrants, I think each country has their system set up at what's best for them. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. I'd love to hear it. If you happen to enjoy, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Also, check out that next video. I'll see you guys there.